What's up guys, Vlad from N7 Cards here, today with a special little video in which I'll be trying to explain how to play Magic the Gathering to you. The main idea about this is that if we already show you all those different TCGs, be it Pokemon, MetaZoom, Magic, all of them, that we should at least give you the chance to actually play them as well. Which is why we have this explaining video now, to try and explain to you how to play Magic the Gathering. So, Magic is played with, as you could probably already guess, the cards from the TCG, which are then funneled into different decks. For the explanation video I will use an older deck of mine, a red and black deck that I built myself quite some time ago. It's a casual deck, so nothing too special, but it should definitely work for explaining how Magic works. So, the thing with Magic is it's various turns. You take turns with your opponent. A turn is consisting of a beginning phase, a first main phase, the combat phase, a second main phase, and the end phase. After that, you pass the turn to your opponent, he takes your turn, so on and so forth. You usually have a set amount of health, depending on which kind of format you play. For the 60 card format, which is called Standard, you have 20 health. So, just to simulate it a bit, we're going to use the Phyrexia spin down we have, which coincidentally has exactly the 20 health we need for that. Now, as for the cards themselves, I'm gonna give you a quick explanation about the cards now, so you at least know what we're looking at. So, this is the basic look of a Magic card. You have the card name up here on top, in this case Shambling Remains. Next to that you have the mana cost. The number in the gray area, well, if the focus works, this one in the gray circle means that you can pay 1 mana of any color for it. Then you've got this black skull symbol and this red fire-like symbol, which means you need to pay 1 black and 1 red mana, plus the 1 colorless. For those 3 mana you could play this card. I'll come back to the mana in a second. Then you have a picture of the card, what card it is. In this type it's a creature card, and in this case what type of creature it is, like zombie, horror. Those two are important in the way that specific effects trigger depending on either card type or on what creature type it is. So for example, if you have cards that trigger against creature cards, it would work, or if you have effects that trigger to zombies or horrors, it would work with this as well. Then afterwards you have a quick explanation about some of the card's abilities, like this card can't block, and for 1 black and 1 red mana you can activate the ability Unearth. More on the abilities later, but I'm trying to stay with the basics. Down here for creature cards you have Power, which essentially is the damage and defense of the creature, and Toughness, which essentially are the health points of the creature cards. Like I said, just a quick rundown of what the card has. We go more into detail later where it becomes important. Alright, as for the mana cost I talked about. You gain mana by playing land cards. Those, for example, would be the basic land cards. There are 5 colors in total. You have white with this symbol, which as the basic cards is shown by plains, forests for green mana, mountains for red mana, islands for blue mana, and the swamps for black mana. Those are the basic lands. There are specific lands that can either give 2 kinds of color or give more types or have some other effects, but those are the basic land cards that do nothing but give you 1 mana if you play it and activate it. But we'll get to that now. Alright, at the start I said we're playing or I'm showing the standard format, which is a 60 card deck, 20 health, that's it. It's among the 3 most popular formats. Those being standard, which is the basic 60 card decks made. Usually if you have a tournament standard, it's of the most recent Magic sets. If you just have casual plays with friends, most people won't care if it's older cards as well. Then you have the booster draft, which is most famously known for the Friday Night Magic, where you take 3 boosters, open them, pass them around, and out of those 42 to 45 cards you need to build a 40 card deck and then play tournament style. Or Commander, which was my favorite format and the one we played most, which is essentially a 100 card deck where you choose one legendary creature to be your commander, and that creature decides what kind of colors you can use. Like for example, if the Shambling Horror would be a legendary creature, him as commander would mean I can only use black and red mana, because that's his color identity. Those are the only colors he has on his card. So that's the basic formats essentially. Now, to start a game, of course you have to shuffle your deck first. For the start, it's easiest if you ask someone to help you build a deck, buy a pre-built deck or anything of the like. Also, as a piece of personal advice, if you want your cards to remain good, buy yourselves some sleeves, because they go a long way in keeping your cards decent, keeping them good and everything. And for the few bucks they cost, it's just useful to have some sleeves to keep your decks going, keep your decks good and everything. So it starts like most TCGs, you shuffle in your deck and everything. So excuse me while I go ahead and do this real fast. And then I will run you through a few example turns, just to explain more in depth how everything works, to explain the turns more in depth, which I just gave you a basic rundown of at the start. All of that. Alrighty. So for Magic, your starting hand consists of 7 cards. 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. So this would be our starting hand, and I can immediately see I didn't shuffle good enough, because I have no land cards on this hand. But what this does allow is for me to explain a second thing. Most formats allow a so-called mulligan, which is if you have a too bad hand card, a card where you say I can't start with this, like in this case I would have no mana on my hand, no land cards, so I can't play any of my cards, which allow you to put your cards to the side and draw a new starting set. The most used mulligan by now is you have one free mulligan, where you pull now back up to 7 cards. 6, 7. If you need to use a mulligan afterwards again, then you would go down to 6 cards. You essentially lose a starting card, but you scry 1 card, which means you would look at the top card of your deck and then either decide, does it stay on top or do I put it on bottom? And then so on and so forth. If your hand is still bad, then you go down to 5 cards. If it's still bad at that point, you would go down to 4. But at that point you essentially can already say, yeah, something with the deck doesn't work. So yeah. Still not a good starting card, but good enough for now. Because I have a land I can play, and I have a card that I can play for single mana already. In this case, it's a card with double mana, so that means I can pay this with either a single black or a single red mana, which makes it quite easy. Alright, now usually you decide who starts the game, usually by a dice throw or something of the like. For the simplicity, I'ma just start myself now. We have the beginning phase, which has untap, upkeep, then draw. Since I'm the starting player, I don't draw a card, it's only from the second person in the turn order that the drawing starts. Since I don't have anything laying on the field yet, the other steps are not important right now. So now we get to main phase 1, which is also known as the pre-combat main phase. I can now play my land, which important part is you can only play one land per turn. I'm gonna play a swamp now, which then allows me to tap it. Tapping a card activates it, but also means you can't use this card this turn anymore. But in tapping a land, you activate the land and you get this 1 black mana into a so-called mana pool, which means you now have 1 black mana floating in the mana pool. Using this black mana, I use it to pay for this creature, the Rakdos Cackler, which is a 1 power, 1 toughness creature devil that I can now play. That finishes my pre-combat main phase because I can't do anything else. We will now go to the combat phase, but unless a creature has the haste ability or another ability that allows it to immediately attack, a creature has summoning fatigue at the start, which means it can't immediately attack after being summoned. So right now I have this card, I could use it to block already, but that's about it. So that means I can't do anything in the combat phase, which means we jump to the post-combat main phase, where I could, if I hadn't already, still play a land. Since I have already, I can't. Or still summon creatures, play enchantments, play artifacts, all of the like. I can't do anything, so we go to the end phase, where we get the end step, the cleanup step, at which point all creatures that haven't been killed would heal back up to their full health, and then I pass the turn over to my enemy. Now my enemy would run their normal turn, and then it will go back to me. Now at the start of the beginning phase we have the untap step, where all cards that are tapped, in this case the swamp, would untap, can be used again. Then we have the upkeep, where certain abilities that trigger during the upkeep, where you have to pay with your life for effects or stuff like that, trigger now. Then we get to the draw phase, where you draw a single card, which is very good since I drew another mana card. Which means we go to the main phase 1, the pre-combat main phase. I play a mana card again. And I pay with 2 black mana in the pool to play a Tavern Swindler. Now, the Tavern Swindler has a tap ability. Since it also has Summoning Fatigue, I can't play it and instantly tap it, but I can use that next turn, where I will explain more to you on that. So, that's my pre-combat turn. Now we get to a combat turn. I start combat, in this case, by declaring attackers, which in this case the only attacker I can declare is my Rakdos Cackler, which I then declare as an attacker. If my opponent now has creatures of their own, they can declare them as a blocker. In this case, there is no opponent, no blockers. We'll run an example combat turn of that in a bit. But now he doesn't declare any blockers. Then we get to the damage step, which at this point means the power of my Cackler, which is 1, goes through, he deals 1 damage. If he gets blocked, he would deal the 1 damage to the creature, but also take the damage from the creature. Since he's not blocked, he deals 1 damage to my opponent, which means my opponent's life would now tick down from 20 to 90. And as you can probably already guess, the easiest way or the common way to defeat your opponent is just get his life to 0. There are different types to defeat your opponent, but I'm not going into them now, that would turn all of this too complicated. After a creature has attacked, it gets tapped, same as the land, which means this creature can't do anything anymore. If my opponent would now attack me, I could only block using my Tavern Swindler, because it's the only untapped card I have. Because tapped creatures can no longer block, just the same as you can't use tapped land cards. They're out of it. So, we now have the end of the combat phase. Post combat, I can't do anything anymore. We go to the end step, I can't do anything. Now my opponent has his turn. I let his turn play down, but in his turn somewhere, after his combat preferably, I can use the ability of my Tavern Swindler now, which means I tap it. I would then pay 3 life, as it says here, and I flip a coin. If I win the flip, I gain 6 life. So, just to explain how some of the tap abilities work, I tap it at the end of my opponent's turn, use the ability, either lose 3 life or win 3 life, essentially, and that ends my opponent's turn. But now my turn starts, and right at the beginning phase I have the untap step, where I can untap both my creatures and my land cards again, which means that I could use this ability during my opponent's time. To use abilities during your opponent's turn, they either are tap abilities like this, are abilities that specifically say you can use them during other turns, or are so-called spell cards that have instant as their card type. I'm gonna take a quick look if I find one of them. For example, this one, the Lightning Strike. It says instant right here on the card, which means I can essentially play it in every step. Like, not just in the main phases where you would play all the other cards, but which means I can play it in every step to deal 3 damage to a target creature or player. Now let me just pop that back in. Okay, so we have the untap, the upkeep again, and the draw step. Another land, which works perfectly, since in my main phase I will now play another land card. I will pay a red and a black mana to play a Rixmardy Guildmage. I'd keep this one land untapped for now. We would then go again to the combat phase. I would attack with my creatures, deal maybe some damage, maybe get them blocked, who knows. Then we go to the second main phase. In this step now, I pay the last mana to play Divest, a sorcery, which then would allow me to choose my enemy. He has to reveal their heart, and I can cause him to discard an artifact or creature card from his hand. At this point, sorceries are immediately used. They're essentially dead. Which means those cards would now go to the graveyard. Alright, that finishes my turn. We go through a few more turns this way. And now I'm gonna show you what a bigger combat step would look like. Let's say my opponent has a Tavern Swindler and a Shambling Remains laying there. So, I attack using all my creatures. He would decide to block using his 2. Now, let's say he uses the Shambling Remains to block my Rixmardy Guildmage, and uses his Tavern Swindler to block my Tavern Swindler. Now, in the case that an opponent blocks, you go through the creatures. They have 2 power, so they deal 2 damage to each other. Unless they have specific effects that state they attack first or last, that's how it works. Damage gets put in at the same time. Since they have 2 health, the 2 damage are enough to kill them, which would destroy both his Tavern Swindler and my Tavern Swindler, which means they both would go to the graveyard. So they're both gone now in that case. On the other hand, my Rixmardy Guildmage against his Shambling Remains. Mine has 2 power, so it deals 2 damage to his Shambling Remains, which would put it at 1 toughness remaining, so it has 1 health point left. But he has 4 damage, which means he puts me at -2, which kills my Rick-Smarty Guild Mage, but his Shambling Remains would survive. The Rectus Cackler doesn't get blocked, I deal 1 damage to him. Now, the turn continues, and at the end phase we have the end step and the cleanup step again. At that point, all not dead creatures heal, which means his Shambling Remains now gets back from 1 health remaining to 3 health remaining, which puts him back at full health. All of this continues using various cards, for example, not just using creatures, but using at some point a base in Dragonfire, which deals 4 damage to target creature to destroy his Shambling Remains. Then also continuing and using stuff like a Shock to deal 2 damage to my enemy directly, just ignoring all his creatures. All of this continues with a little back and forth to the point where one of the players hits 0 health essentially. Once you hit 0 health, you've of course lost the game. That's it. So yeah, that were some example turns, the basic idea of how to play Magic. That you need to use your mana to pay for your creatures, to pay for your spells, to play for your sorceries, your instants, your artifacts. There is still a lot more to Magic. Specific effects, abilities that allow you to mix all of this up, like abilities that immediately let your creatures attack after being summoned, or creatures that give you mana as well, or artifacts that give you mana. There's also still stuff like the specific lands that, for example, the Bloodfell Caves, when it enters the battlefield tapped immediately, which means I can't use it in the first turn, but I would also gain 1 life by playing it, and then once I tap it I can add either a black or a red mana to my pool, depending on what works better. Or there are also cards that immediately give 2 mana to you instead of just the 1 mana from the normal land cards. All of that is more specific stuff at that point already. The basic of Magic is you play 1 land per turn, you use your lands to pay for mana, to pay for creatures, sorceries, instants, artifacts, all of that stuff. Then use your creatures, your spells and everything to attack your opponent, deal damage to your opponent, all until the point where either you've managed to defeat your opponent or your opponent managed to defeat you. That's the basic of Magic. Of course, there's still a lot more, but that's just a quick rundown. Now, as a slight reminder, you can use this to remember your turn order. Just make a screenshot, write it down or whatever. It's beginning step with your untap, upkeep, draw. Your main phase where you can play your 1 land per turn. Remember, only 1 land per turn, unless you have specific cards that allow you to play extra lands per turn. But from your hand, without any cards with other effects, you can only play 1 land per turn. I know there's more abilities to play more lands, but the basic is 1 land per turn. Not trying to get too complicated, because this is already enough for one video. I don't want to completely confuse you. Then you cast your creatures and your other spells. You get to combat, you declare your attackers. Afterwards your opponent declares your blockers. The damage is dealt. You get your second main phase, where it's the same as the first one. And you get your end step, where your creatures heal and you pass the turn over. Rinse and repeat until one of you decides to fall over dead. So yeah, that's the most basics you need to know to play Magic. I hope I managed to explain it all in a coherent way that you actually understood. If you have any questions, just drop them down in the comments. We will try our best to answer them. And yeah, if I managed to help you with that, if you liked, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, a comment, or just subscribe. And yeah, I hope I managed to help you at least a bit with that. And I'll see you next time. Peace out.